Switching tracks to some news from COP29, which is underway in Azerbaijan's capital Baku. The atmosphere is intense as climate experts and delegates work against the clock to push for action. Scientists at the United Nations climate talks say carbon pollution levels are continuing to rise worldwide. Despite dropping in the US and Europe, this year the world is on track to put 41.2 billion tons of main heat-trapping gas into the atmosphere. That's a 0.8% increase from 2023, according to Global Carbon Project, a group of scientists who track the world's and countries' carbon emissions. The carbon pollution jump comes as several UN reports say the globe has to cut emissions by 42% by 2030 to possibly limit warming to an internationally agreed upon threshold. To discuss more on this, we are joined by Zerin, Osho, Bamezai, Raina. She's the Director of India Program at the Indian Institute of Governance and Sustainable Development. Thank you very much for joining us, Zerin. Tell me a little bit about the short-lived climate pollutants, why they are important and how could they possibly impact India really?
Thank you so much for having me, and a very good afternoon to everybody from Baku. It is day 3 of the negotiations here at COP29, and we are very closely following what has happened yesterday. There was a high-level summit on non-CO2 methane abatement, and what was discussed there was the second half, or the 50% of the climate change problem, which is SLCPs, or non-carbon dioxide emissions. SLCPs are the short form for something called as short-lived climate pollutants. They are different from carbon dioxide because unlike CO2, they do not last in the atmosphere for those lifetimes. Carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for about 100 plus years, whereas short-lived climate pollutants have lifetimes of anywhere between a couple of weeks to 20 years. 2 weeks for black carbon, while 20 years for methane. SLCPs are critical in our fight against climate change because they are the pollutants and the gases that are responsible for creating heat trapping environments. So when we look at India, a lot of the times we have seen that Delhi's temperatures have crossed 50 degrees centigrade in summer months. That is a result of growing significantly higher SLCP emissions. That is why action on SLCPs is critical.
Right. Now, Zerin, how is the ongoing discussion at COP29 putting a spotlight on the non-CO2 emissions? And what is India's role in these ongoing discussions?
So first time that methane was spoken about along with the other non-CO2 SLCP emissions, it was COP26. And here we are at COP29. And in 3 years, we have seen the spotlight on the second half of the climate change problem, which is non-CO2, be raised to the head of state level, to the top of the climate agenda. Just yesterday, we saw a summit that was hosted by the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework on Climate Change, Patricia Espinosa, launching the need for a spotlight and the announcement of over $2 billion in financing for mitigation of SLCPs. We heard the special envoy from China, John Podesta, the climate special envoy from the United States of America, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Canada, and the UK, Minister Ed Miliband, talk about how countries must come together on fighting methane emissions, the growing methane emissions. Methane is the second most potent greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide. And on a 20-year period, it is 84 times more heat trapping than carbon dioxide. This is also going to have far-reaching consequences on the negotiations that are underway on the NCQG, which is the new collective quantifiable goal. COP29 has been touted as the climate finance COP. And this is where the money is going to be utilized, including the government of India. The stance has been that climate finance through these negotiations, which until yesterday, the G77 group of countries put a number to, which is of US $1.3 trillion, is going to be utilized. Resiliency and adaptation. This is where SLCPs come close. With the growing heat stress in India, decreasing agricultural outputs, and the huge benefits that it has on climate and public health, SLCPs are going to be forming a huge chunk of where the action is going to be put in. We also have seen that Delhi faces an air quality crisis each year. And every year there are measures put out by the government and nothing really conclusive happens on it. With discussions, including here at COP29, where we've seen the United States and China, which are the top two emitters of methane, come together, despite China being a developing country. And despite the fact that US and China are on most occasions at loggerheads with one another, shows the need for why SLCPs is important and the geopolitical ramifications of that.
True.
India needs to step up. India must step up given sheer size of the economy, the number of people that are going to be hit by the growing heat stress. There is a World Bank report that states that 34 million jobs are at risk due to the increasing heat stress. With temperatures over 50 degrees centigrade, we can also now look at India really testing the human survivability limits on heat.
Now, Zerin, what is the significance of the Global N2O assessment report that was released yesterday? Tell us a little more about it.
Yes, yesterday at the same event, the SLCP summit, high-level summit, there was also another report, a landmark report that was released on nitrous oxide, N2O. It is the first ever global assessment on N2O, and it's critical because the report talks about the different measures that could be adopted by governments to reduce emissions of nitrous oxide by 40%. For our viewers, nitrous oxide is the emissions of greenhouse gases that come directly from the use of fertilizer and animal manure. And with 40% reduction, we can essentially equate it to 6 years of burning fossil fuel emissions. It is equivalent to burning 6 years of fossil fuels by the end of this century, 2100. And we can also look at reducing premature deaths of approximately 20 million people around the world.
Zerin, the chief executive of COP29 has been filmed apparently agreeing to facilitate fossil fuel deals at the climate summit. What are your comments on that?
Azerbaijan is a petrostate, and it is here where COP29 is being held. We just yesterday heard the Azerbaijani government talk about oil and gas being the gift of God. It is true that the Azerbaijani government makes a lot of its economy is based on oil and gas. So it is not a surprise that we have heard COP29 presidency talk about striking oil and gas deals. A similar story had come out of the meetings preceding the COP28 in UAE.